I never meant to see it. I was only getting a glass of water. But at 2:14 in the morning, in the blue dark of our apartment, I watched the one person I trusted most slide a floorboard back into place like he'd done it 100 times before, and I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that I didn't know him at all. He turned. He saw me standing there. And for 3 full seconds, neither of us said a single word. I should have gone back to bed. I should have pretended I saw nothing. Instead, I asked him the one question that would unravel everything we'd built. But what happened next changed my life forever. The apartment above Delaney's hardware smelled like old wood and coffee that had gone cold twice. I'd lived there for 3 years, and for the last one, Sawyer Reyes had lived there with me. We weren't supposed to make sense as roommates. I was the kind of person who color-coded my sheet music and cried during grocery store commercials. Sawyer fixed motorcycle engines for a living and had a laugh that could rattle the windows. But somehow, in the second month of living together, when my father's old cassette player broke and I sat on the kitchen floor at midnight trying to fix it with a butter knife, Sawyer had knelt down beside me without a word and held the flashlight until we got it working again. That was Sawyer. He noticed things. He showed up. He also, according to every piece of evidence I had, was completely and uncomplicatedly straight. He talked about women the way other guys talked about football scores, casually, cheerfully, without any weight behind it. He dated a barista named Priya for 4 months the year before. He kept a photo of his college girlfriend, Mara, tucked into an old wallet he never used, for luck, he said. So when I woke up that night, not from a nightmare, not from noise, just from the strange, itchy restlessness that comes from writing music until your brain won't switch off, I wasn't looking for anything except water. The hallway floor was cold under my bare feet. The living room was dark except for the orange glow of the street lamp outside, slicing through the blinds in thin stripes across the couch, the bookshelf, and Sawyer, kneeling by the window with a section of floorboard lifted in his hands. I stopped in the doorway. He hadn't heard me yet. He was so focused on whatever he was doing that his shoulders had that particular stillness I only ever saw when he was concentrating on an engine that wouldn't turn over. There was a shoebox in his lap. He was placing something inside it. I couldn't tell what, just a flash of white paper, and his hands were not steady. I must have shifted my weight, because the floor creaked, and Sawyer's head snapped up. For a moment his face did something I'd never seen it do. Fear. Not startled in the dark fear. Something deeper. Something that looked like getting caught at the exact center of himself. Eli. He said my name carefully, like it might break something if he said it wrong. You're up. I could ask you the same thing. I nodded at the floorboard. What is that? He looked down at the shoebox like he was surprised to find it still in his hands. Then he set it back into the gap in the floor, slow and deliberate, and pressed the board down until it clicked into place. When he stood, he was smiling, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was the smile he used on customers at the shop when he was closing early and didn't want to explain why. Nothing, he said. Just some old stuff. You know how I am, sentimental idiot who can't throw anything away. It might have worked if I hadn't seen his hands shaking. Sawyer, go back to bed, Eli. His voice had an edge now, gentle but final, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. It's late. I didn't push. That was my first mistake, or maybe my first act of mercy. I've never been sure which. I went back to my room, lay in the dark, and listened to him not come to bed for another 40 minutes. I told myself it was nothing. People keep boxes. People have secrets that don't mean anything. But something in me, something that had been quietly, stupidly, hopelessly in love with my best friend for the better part of a year, knew that whatever was under that floorboard had a shape exactly the size of my own heart breaking. I just didn't know yet whose heart it actually belonged to. I didn't bring it up the next morning. Sawyer made eggs like nothing had happened, humming along to the radio, flicking a dish towel at me when I stole the last piece of toast. If I hadn't seen his hands shaking at 2 a.m., I might have believed the whole thing was a dream. But I started watching him. Not in a way I was proud of. I wasn't hunting for evidence, I told myself, just paying closer attention. And the closer I looked, the more small cracks I found in the version of Sawyer I thought I knew. He'd started leaving the apartment on Tuesday and Thursday nights, always around 11:30, always with the same excuse, helping a buddy from the shop, picking up a part before the store closes. He'd come back smelling like hand sanitizer instead of motor oil. He'd started keeping his phone face down on every surface, which he'd never done before. And twice that week, I caught him staring at nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes somewhere far away, until I said his name and he blinked back into the room like he was surfacing from underwater. "You okay?" I asked him on Thursday, watching him lace up his boots by the door. "Yeah." He didn't look up. "Just tired." "You've been tired a lot lately." That got his attention. He looked up at me, and for a second I saw something raw pass through his expression, something almost like "please don't." Then it was gone, replaced by the easy grin I'd known for a year. "Careful, Eli. Anyone would think you were worried about me. Anyone would be right." He laughed, short and a little too loud, and left before I could say anything else. I sat with that laugh for a long time after the door closed. It wasn't real. I'd heard Sawyer's real laugh. It lived in his chest and came out slow, like it surprised even him. This one had lived only in his throat. I told myself I was imagining things because of how I felt about him. That's the danger of loving someone you can't have. You start reading meaning into everything, hoping that some hidden signal will turn out to be about you. But I couldn't shake the shoebox. I couldn't shake his hands. That night, I did something I wasn't proud of. When I heard his motorcycle pull away just before midnight, I got up, walked to the window, and lifted the floorboard myself. The shoebox was gone. He'd taken it with him. Whatever was in that box, Sawyer was carrying it out into the night now, and I had no way to follow him without admitting I'd been watching. So instead, I did the only thing that felt honest. I waited up, and when he came home at 1 a.m., smelling faintly of candle wax and rain, I was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to wait up." "I know." I slid the second cup toward the empty chair. "Sit anyway." He hesitated, actually hesitated, which Sawyer never did about anything, and then sat. His hair was damp. There was a faint red mark on the side of his hand, like he'd been gripping something too tightly. "Long night?" I asked. "Something like that. You know you can tell me things." I kept my voice light, careful, like I was coaxing a spooked animal instead of the most solid person I'd ever known. "Whatever it is, I'm not going anywhere." Something flickered across his face. Hope, maybe, or its opposite. "It's not that simple, Eli. Try me." He turned the mug in slow circles on the table, not drinking from it. "There are things about me you don't know. Okay, things I've never told anyone. Not my parents. Not Mara. Not the guys at the shop." His voice had dropped, rough at the edges. "Things that would change how you see me." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. Some reckless, hopeful part of me wanted to reach across the table and say I already know. I think I've known for months, and it wouldn't change anything except maybe make me love you more. But I was too afraid of being wrong. Too afraid of turning a private moment into a confession that was mine to make, not his. "Nothing you tell me is going to make me walk out that door," I said instead. "I promise you that." He looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding whether the promise could hold his weight. Then his jaw tightened, and the moment closed like a fist. "It's late," he said, standing, taking his untouched tea to the sink. "We should sleep." "Sawyer." "Please, Eli." His back was to me. His shoulders were rigid. "Not tonight." I let him go. I always let him go in those early days, because I was more afraid of losing him as a friend than I was brave enough to risk everything to have him as something more. I didn't know yet that my carefulness was buying us both more pain than my honesty ever could have. The next 2 weeks were a strange, quiet war of near misses. Sawyer kept vanishing on Tuesday and Thursday nights. I kept not asking, and then asking anyway, in smaller and smaller ways. A comment about the mileage on his bike, a question about his schedule at the shop that didn't add up. Every time, he deflected with a joke or a change of subject, or, once, a hand on my shoulder that lingered a half-second too long before he caught himself and pulled away. That was the part that confused me most, because in between the secrecy, nothing else had changed. If anything, Sawyer had gotten softer with me, not more distant. He remembered that I hated the smell of lilies after my grandmother's funeral and switched the air freshener without me asking. He started leaving the porch light on for me when I came home late from rehearsal. Once, when I fell asleep on the couch working on a composition, I woke to find his jacket draped over me and the television turned down low so it wouldn't wake me. If I hadn't known better, I would have called it the behavior of a man falling in love. But Sawyer was straight. Sawyer dated women. Sawyer kept Mara's photo in his wallet for luck. I had built an entire fortress of evidence to protect myself from hoping for something that could shatter me, and I clung to it even as the walls kept cracking. It was Priya, of all people, who cracked them further. I ran into her at the coffee shop where she still worked, 3 months after she and Sawyer had ended things. She asked how he was doing, and I said fine, and she got this look on her face, not bitter, just knowing. He's a good guy, she said, wiping down the counter. I want you to know that. Whatever's going on with him right now. What do you mean? She glanced around, lowered her voice like she was handing me something fragile. We didn't break up because of anything I did. He told me, near the end, that he cared about me, genuinely, but that it felt like something was missing. Like he was trying to force a shape he didn't fit into. She shrugged, not unkindly. I always wondered what he meant by that. I walked home with her words looping in my chest like a melody I couldn't place. Trying to force a shape he didn't fit into. That night, when Sawyer left again at 11:30, I didn't wait at the table. I followed him. I kept 2 streets back, my heart hammering harder than it had any right to for a man on foot trailing his roommate's motorcycle taillight through empty streets. Sawyer didn't drive far, 6 blocks, to the old brick building that used to be a Methodist chapel before the congregation moved out to the highway and the building became a community center that hosted everything from AA meetings to pottery classes. I watched him park, pull off his helmet, and stand for a moment outside the door, head bowed, like he was gathering courage for something. Then he went inside. I should have turned around. Instead, I crept to the side window, where the blinds hadn't been fully closed, and looked in. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't a secret girlfriend, or a gambling habit, or anything my anxious mind had conjured in the 2 weeks since the floorboard. It was a circle of folding chairs in a low-lit room, maybe a dozen people, ranging in age from barely 20 to silver-haired. A hand-lettered banner on the wall read, "You are not alone. Peer support circle." Sawyer sat down in an empty chair. Someone touched his shoulder in greeting. He managed a smile, small and tired, before dropping his eyes to his hands. A young woman near the front was speaking, but I couldn't hear the words through the glass. Whatever she said made Sawyer's throat move like he was swallowing something painful. I stood there in the cold, watching the person I loved sit inside a room built for people carrying weight too heavy to carry alone, and I understood, with a shame that still sits in me, that I had spent 2 weeks afraid he was hiding a secret that would hurt me, when the whole time, he'd been the one hurting, quietly, and I had been too wrapped up in my own hope and fear to see it. I didn't go in. It wasn't my place, and I knew it. I walked home alone, and this time, I was the one who sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, waiting. When Sawyer came in near 1 a.m. and saw me there, something in his face gave way entirely. "You followed me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just tired, plain fact. I did. I didn't defend it. I'm sorry. I was scared, and I did something I shouldn't have. He sat down across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "It's a grief group," he finally said, "for people who lost someone to suicide." The word landed heavy between us. "My mother," he said, before I could ask. "6 years ago. I've never told anyone here. Not even at the shop. My dad, he's a pastor, Eli. He stood up at her funeral and called it a private struggle, like it was something to be embarrassed about, something you don't say out loud. I grew up learning to keep everything that hurt locked under the floor, so to speak. Literally, apparently. A broken half-laugh. I started going 3 months ago. I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to look at me differently. Softer. Broken. I wouldn't have. I know that now." He looked up at me, eyes shining in the kitchen light. I didn't know it then. I reached across the table and took his hand, the one with the faint red mark I'd noticed weeks before, from gripping the edges of his folding chair too hard. I understood now, not from any mystery at all. "Thank you for trusting me with it," I said. He didn't let go of my hand. Not for a long time. Something shifted after that night, the way a room shifts when a window finally opens after being sealed shut too long. Sawyer still went to his Tuesday and Thursday meetings, but he stopped hiding it. Sometimes he'd tell me small things afterward, not details of the group, but how he felt. Lighter, some nights. Hollowed out, others. I learned to just sit with him in whichever version showed up at our door, the way he'd once sat with me in a broken cassette player, holding the flashlight without needing to fix anything himself. The shoebox came up again on a rainy evening in early spring. I found it sitting on the coffee table instead of hidden under the floor, and Sawyer, sitting beside it, looked at me the way a person looks at a bridge they're deciding whether to cross. "You can look," he said. If you want. Inside were folded pages, dozens of them, some yellowed with age, some clearly newer. I recognized his handwriting immediately. It covered every wall of every note he'd ever left me on the fridge. Letters, he said, before I could ask. To my mom, mostly. Things I never got to say. The group leader suggested it, in the beginning. Write what you can't speak. He paused. Some of them aren't to her. My hand stilled over the box. Who else? He didn't answer right away. He reached in and pulled out a single folded page, newer than the rest, the creases still sharp. Read it if you want, he said. Or don't. I think I need you to know it exists either way. I unfolded it with hands that weren't quite steady. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Dear Eli, it began. I don't know how to tell you that the last year has been the first time since my mother died that I felt like the walls in my chest were coming down instead of closing in. I don't know how to tell you that it terrifies me, how much I look forward to the sound of your key in the door. I keep telling myself it's just friendship, because friendship is safe, and the other thing, the thing I'm afraid to name, feels like standing at the edge of everything my father ever told me I wasn't allowed to be. I don't know if I'm brave enough yet. I hope one day I will be. The rain kept falling against the window. I looked up from the page, and Sawyer was watching me with an expression more naked than I had ever seen on him, more afraid, and more hopeful than the night I'd caught him at the floorboard. Sawyer, I said, and my voice came out unsteady. I have been in love with you for almost a year. His breath caught audibly. Eli, I didn't say anything because I thought I already knew every wall between us, and I thought this was one of them. I thought loving you meant learning to live quietly beside you and never say it out loud. You don't have to anymore. His hand found mine across the space between the couch cushions, careful, like he still couldn't quite believe it was allowed. I don't want you to have to anymore. Neither of us moved for a long moment, just held on, letting the rain fill the silence around two people who had finally stopped hiding from each other. Then, slowly, like a question neither of us needed to ask aloud, he leaned in, and I met him halfway, and the first kiss tasted like relief and rain and a year of almost finally becoming something real. The weeks that followed felt like a held breath finally let go. We didn't announce anything to the world right away. Some truths need time before they're ready for other people's eyes. But within our own four walls, everything was different. Sawyer stopped flinching when his phone buzzed with a message from his father. He started leaving his letters to his mother open on the table instead of locked beneath the floor, and sometimes he read me pieces of them, his voice unsteady but no longer afraid. I thought, foolishly, that the hardest part was behind us. It was Sawyer's father who proved me wrong. He called on a Sunday, the way he always did, and I watched Sawyer's face change the moment he answered. Not fear exactly, but the old careful blankness sliding back over him like a mask he still knew how to wear. His father was coming to town, for the first time in 2 years. He wanted to see the apartment. He wanted to meet Eli, the roommate, whom Sawyer had apparently mentioned in passing calls without ever specifying what I actually was. We could tell him, I said carefully, that night. Or we don't have to. Whatever you need. Sawyer sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like the answer might be hiding under it, the way so many of his answers once had been. He buried my mother like her pain was a scandal to be managed, he said quietly. I don't know what he'll do with mine. You don't owe him your whole self if it isn't safe. I know. He looked up at me. But I'm so tired of managing what's safe, Eli. I did that for 6 years, and it didn't protect me from anything. It just kept me alone. I didn't have an answer for that. Not one that would make the choice easier for him. So I did the only thing I could. I sat beside him, took his hand, and told him that whatever he decided, I would be there on the other side of it. His father arrived on a Thursday evening in a gray coat that looked like armor. He was polite in the stiff, formal way of a man used to being listened to rather than heard. He shook my hand and called me Eli, the roommate, exactly as promised, and for an hour, the three of us sat in a careful, brittle kind of peace. Then his father noticed the letters on the coffee table. Sawyer had forgotten to put them away, and picked one up before either of us could stop him. I watched Sawyer's whole body go rigid as his father's eyes moved down the page. It wasn't a letter to his mother. It was one of the ones addressed to me. The silence that followed felt like the entire apartment had stopped breathing. Sawyer, his father said finally, voice very quiet, very controlled. What is this? And I watched the man I loved stand at the exact edge his letter had described 6 weeks earlier, the edge of everything he'd been taught he wasn't allowed to be, and choose, for the first time in his life, not to step back from it. "It's the truth," Sawyer said. His voice didn't shake. That was the part that surprised me most. After everything, after years of folding himself smaller to survive his own house, his voice came out steady, almost gentle, like he'd been rehearsing this exact moment in every letter he'd ever written and never sent. "I love him," Sawyer said, nodding toward me without looking away from his father. "Eli, not as a roommate, not as a friend I happen to live with. I have for a while now, and I spent a long time being ashamed of it because you taught me that anything painful or complicated about a person was something to keep behind closed doors. I'm done doing that." His father's jaw worked silently for a moment. The letter was still in his hand, trembling slightly. "Your mother," he started. "Don't," Sawyer said, and for the first time, there was an edge in it. Not cruelty, just 6 years of grief finally finding a voice. "Don't use her to end this conversation the way you used silence to end hers. I go to a group twice a week to learn how to grieve her out loud, because you taught me not to. I am not going to make the same mistake with this." The room was so quiet I could hear the rain starting again against the window, the same rain that had been falling the night Sawyer first let me read his letter. His father looked at me then, really looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, and something in his stiff, careful expression cracked, just slightly, like a man realizing he was standing on ground that had already shifted beneath him without his permission. "I don't understand this," he said finally. Not a condemnation, just an admission, small and human. "You don't have to understand it tonight," Sawyer said, "but I need you to know it isn't going away, and I'm not going away either. Not the parts of myself I used to hide. Not him." His father didn't answer. He set the letter down, very carefully, like it might still change back into something less true if he handled it gently enough. He left without another word, his gray coat disappearing down the stairwell, and neither of us knew, in that moment, whether the door he'd walked through would ever open again from his side. Sawyer stood very still after the door closed, staring at the space where his father had been. "You did that," I said softly. "You said it out loud." "I did." He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "I don't know if it changes anything with him. It changed something in you." I stepped closer, took his hand. The mark from all those tight-gripped folding chairs long since faded from his skin. That's the part that was always going to matter most. He looked at me for a long moment, something fragile and new settling behind his eyes. Not relief, exactly. Something steadier than relief. Something that looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who had finally stopped bracing for the floor to open beneath him. His father didn't call for 3 weeks. Sawyer didn't pretend it didn't hurt. He sat with it the way he'd learned to sit with grief in that low-lit room with the folding chairs, not hiding it, not drowning in it, just letting it exist without needing to resolve it faster than it was ready to resolve. I sat with him through it, the way he'd once sat beside me on the kitchen floor with a flashlight, not fixing anything, just staying. On a Thursday in early June, almost a year to the day since I'd first watched him lift a floorboard in the dark, a letter arrived. An actual letter, paper and stamp, in his father's careful handwriting. Sawyer read it alone on the balcony while I waited inside, giving him whatever space the moment needed. When he came back in, his eyes were red, but something in his shoulders had loosened. "He's not ready to talk yet," Sawyer said, but he asked if he could write instead. Said it might be easier for both of us if he didn't have to say it out loud. A small, disbelieving laugh. "He asked about you. Said he was sorry he never asked your last name." "That's a start," I said. "It's a start," he agreed. That evening, we walked to the old Chapelturn Community Center, not for his Thursday meeting this time, but just to sit outside on the steps where he'd once stood gathering courage before every session. The building was quiet, the windows dark, the banner inside. "You are not alone," just barely visible through the glass in the last of the evening light. "I used to come here and think I was the only person who felt like 2 different people," Sawyer said. "The one everyone expected, and the one I actually was." "You're not 2 people," I said. "You're just one person who finally stopped hiding half of himself under a floorboard." He laughed, the real laugh, low in his chest, the one that had taken almost a year to earn back fully. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded page, the paper soft at the edges from being carried and unfolded too many times. I wrote you another one, he said. I haven't given you this one yet. I unfolded it there on the steps, in the fading light, and read the only line written on the page. Dear Eli, I used to write letters to people because I was too afraid to say things out loud. This is the last one I'm writing you, because everything I need to tell you, I want to say to your face, every day, for as long as you'll let me. I looked up at him. He was watching me with the same steady, unguarded look he'd worn the night everything under that floorboard had finally come into the light. Say it. Then, I said, my voice barely above the sound of the wind moving through the trees along the street. I love you, Sawyer said, simply, like it had never been complicated at all. I love you, Eli Bennett, and I'm done keeping that anywhere but out in the open, where it belongs. I kissed him there on the chapel steps, under a banner meant for strangers finding their way back to each other. And I thought about the boy who used to hide his grief under floorboards, and the man he'd become, someone who had finally learned that the truest things about a person were never meant to be buried at all, but carried, together, out into the light.